Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the community meeting. I'm going to give a few more minutes for folks to join us before I get started, maybe just 2 more minutes.
Hi, Daisy. Hi, Daisy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
I probably won't be able to be on here the whole time, but anyway, it's good. Thanks for doing this.
Sure, no problem.
I don't have to be seen.
All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let's see, Natisha, is my screen sharing looking okay? Okay, awesome. All right, so let me bring up my slides here. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for this virtual community meeting where we will be talking about accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, here in Santa Cruz County. My name is Daisy Allen, and with me this evening are my colleagues, Stephanie Hansen and Natisha Williams, who will be helping me run the meeting. We work for the planning department, and we focus on updating the county's land use policies. The purpose of this meeting is to provide information to you about potential changes to regulations for ADUs that are currently being considered, and then receive your feedback about these policy ideas. So first, some information about the format of today's meeting. The meeting is being recorded and it will be publicly accessible on the Planning Department website. I will start by giving a presentation that will take about 30 minutes to explain the policy direction that we are proposing, and then I'll be leaving the remainder of the meeting time to take your questions. I will take a moment to explain the technology of the meeting before I jump into the presentation. If you have access to a computer with a microphone, you can watch, listen, and provide comments through your computer using the Microsoft Teams meeting link. If you do not have access to a computer with a microphone and you wish to ask a question or make comments, you need to call in by dialing 916-318-9542, and when prompted, enter the collaboration code 854-773-975#. So, and we can also provide that information in the chat for those that need it. So if you are participating by phone, you will want to mute the sound on your computer. All participants are currently muted, and we will be holding questions until the end of the presentation. If you have a comment about something specific that I've covered in my slides, I'll be happy to pull the slides back up and guide our discussion. At the end of the presentation, I will explain how to ask questions. Okay, so now a little bit of background about ADUs. An ADU, if you're not familiar, is a secondary living unit that is associated with a primary dwelling, either single family or multifamily. ADUs are allowed in all zone districts where housing is allowed. Santa Cruz County's zoning code has long allowed ADUs, and in fact, ADUs are a key part of the county's strategy to build infill development and meet our housing production goals. ADU construction has been increasing since the recession, as can be seen on the graph on the right side of the slide. In both 2018 and 2020, there were some updates to the county's ADU regulations in order to comply with new state ADU laws and to streamline ADU housing development. The most recent updates that were done in 2020, they were done very quickly in order to comply with state law as fast as possible. But unfortunately, there was not guidance available from the state agency at that time on how to interpret some of the confusing provisions in the state law. Since then, the California Office of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD, has released an ADU handbook that provides an opportunity for us to assess whether our local code is aligned with the handbook. Also, after working with our revised code now for over a year, staff have identified some areas where we can simplify and clarify our code so that it is less confusing and also easier to understand. Additionally, there is a need to consider ways that we can update our ADU code to help CZU fire victims in the rebuilding process. So for all of these reasons, we are currently considering updates to the county's ADU regulations. The updates to the ADU regulations are following the schedule that is shown on this slide. We are currently researching and preparing the ordinance, which is why this is a great time to get feedback from you on our policy ideas. We first introduced the policy project at a Housing Advisory Commission meeting in March. We held a community meeting on the topics of both the ADUs and tiny homes on March 16th, followed by a Planning Commission study session on March 24th. And at that study session, the Planning Commission did direct us to separate out the ADU policy project from the tiny homes policy project and to do additional community outreach on both projects. So that is why we're here today holding this community meeting specifically on the topic of ADUs. Since March, we've also gotten the chance to coordinate directly with HCD staff as well as staff from the California Coastal Commission. So some of what I'll present tonight is updated from what was presented at the meetings in March based on new information that we have learned from our coordination with that staff. And then after today's meeting, we will prepare the draft ADU ordinance based on the feedback that we've received so far, and we'll plan to present that ordinance to the Planning Commission in May. We'll also present the ordinance to the Housing Advisory Commission before it goes to the Board of Supervisors, and then on to the Coastal Commission for certification after that. These will all be public hearings where members of the public are welcome and encouraged to attend and provide comments. And if you attended the previous community meeting, you may be wondering, are we still considering regulations for tiny homes? And the answer is yes. We plan to hold additional community meetings on the topic of tiny homes this summer. Okay, and then before I talk through the policy updates that we're looking at, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to the different types of ADUs for those who are not familiar. The different types of ADUs have different rules. ADUs can either be new construction or conversions from existing space in a house, garage, or accessory structure. Additionally, ADUs can be detached from the main house or attached. And then junior ADUs are a special type of ADU that is 500 square feet or smaller and must be converted from within the walls of a single-family house. Junior ADUs must have an efficiency kitchen, which is essentially a kitchenette rather than a full kitchen. Junior ADUs can be internally connected to a primary dwelling, and they can even share bathrooms, but standard ADUs must be completely independent from the primary dwelling. And both standard ADUs and junior ADUs need to have a separate exterior entrance from the main house. So that just provides some background that may be helpful in reviewing the potential changes that we're making to our regulations. Let's see, I'm going to present some of the areas where we're looking at changing our regulations. Some of the changes are needed to comply with state law, and it's fairly cut and dry, so we're simply providing you with the information about what these changes will be. In other cases, as a local jurisdiction, we do have some options, and I'll let you know what those options are. So first, regarding the number of ADUs on a parcel, we are considering modifying the county code to allow for just one ADU and one junior ADU per single family property, which is the minimum that is required by state law. Currently, the county code goes beyond state law and allows for one ADU plus one junior ADU per single family dwelling, meaning that a property with more than one single family dwelling, which is called a dwelling group, could have an ADU plus a junior ADU for each of those dwellings. So an example of a dwelling group, a fairly high density dwelling group, is shown on the top right of this slide. It's multiple single family homes on one parcel. We're considering changing the rule to just meet the minimum state requirement of one ADU and one junior ADU for the whole parcel in order to mitigate for parking and other neighborhood impacts that can occur with multiple ADUs on one parcel. However, this change would result in fewer ADUs in Santa Cruz County. A compromise option that was discussed at the Planning Commission study session would be to allow for multiple ADUs for single family dwelling groups only on larger parcels where this can be more easily accommodated. Let's see, for multifamily properties, we allow for 2 detached ADUs plus conversion ADUs for up to 25% of units. In order to reduce potential parking impacts from ADUs on multifamily properties, we are considering modifying this rule to, again, align with the minimum state law requirement, which is to allow either the detached ADUs or the conversion ADUs. However, again, this would result in fewer ADUs allowed in Santa Cruz County, and it may be appropriate to keep our rules as is in order to provide more development flexibility to property owners. Let's see, and then one gray area in our local code has been how many ADUs we should allow on a property when the existing land use is non-conforming. For instance, what if there is a multifamily dwelling on a lot that's zoned for single family? What if there's a house on a commercial lot? What if there are existing dwellings on a lot that exceed the density that you would usually allow for the zone district? So on this point, the HCD staff has provided some clarity. Single family dwellings should be subject to single family rules, and multifamily dwellings should be subject to multifamily ADU rules. We should allow applicants to build the minimum ADUs that are allowed by state law with just a building permit. So even if the primary dwelling is non-conforming in those situations I described, we would allow a single family dwelling to have an ADU and a junior ADU, and a multifamily dwelling to have the 2 detached ADUs and the conversion ADUs. However, in cases where our local regulations exceed state law minimum, for instance, the dwelling group situation where we allow more than what's required by state law, we could require some kind of special review or special approval in order to allow ADUs on those sites. There's also been confusion about how many ADUs should be allowed for duplexes, which are 2 attached rental units on a single property, such as those shown in the image in the lower right of the slide. The HCD handbook clarifies that a duplex property is subject to the ADU rules for multifamily properties. However, note that if the 2 attached units here were actually for sale units that were located on separate parcels, then they would follow the single family ADU rules. So it's confusing, but we have received some clarity on this from HCD, and we will be adding this information to the county's ADU regulations. Finally, there's been some confusion about junior ADUs and how they are treated in the building code. So since ADUs and junior ADUs need to both have separate exterior entrances, in the eyes of the building code, these are considered to be separate dwellings. So for this reason, if you have a single family house and you have an attached ADU plus a junior ADU, in the eyes of the building code, that would be considered 3 attached dwellings, which would potentially require construction that was built to multifamily building occupancy standards. So this is a building code issue rather than a zoning code issue, but it has come up here, and we will be making sure that applicants are aware of the issue and coordinate closely with building and fire district staff. Okay, and there's also some policy questions related to ADU dwelling size and floor area calculations. We are planning to update our regulations to clarify that ADU size should be counted in terms of habitable square footage rather than gross square footage. And what that means is like a garage or a storage area that's outside the living area of an ADU would not count towards the calculation of the unit size. Also, to align with state law, we plan to remove the size limit for conversion ADUs. Currently, we limit conversion ADUs to 50% of the size of a primary dwelling. There has been concern that removing this limit will result in larger ADUs that are less affordable. For instance, it would mean that if you had a 3,000 square foot barn, for instance, on a property, that could be converted to an ADU, and it might even potentially be larger than the primary dwelling on the property. However, allowing conversion ADUs to be any size does provide more development flexibility to property owners. And in any case, HCD staff have confirmed that we are required to make this change per state law. The other changes that are noted on this slide are all optional. So we are considering whether to align with state law and disallow additions as part of junior ADUs. We currently allow up to 150 square feet of new construction as part of a junior ADU in order to allow for building out kitchenettes or stairways, that kind of thing. We intend to most likely keep that allowance in our local code because it does allow that flexibility for property owners, even though it's not required by state law. Another question that has come up is whether attached ADUs and junior ADUs should be counted towards the county's large dwelling unit calculations. Currently, we require a special discretionary review or extra review for large homes, which are defined as homes that exceed 5,000 square feet. It has previously been staff's interpretation that an ADU or junior ADU should count as part of the overall structure for that calculation, just because it adds to the mass and bulk of the structure. However, it can also be argued that as separate dwelling units, ADUs and junior ADUs perhaps should not be counted towards the square footage of the main house. Either way, the code does need to be clarified to reduce confusion. Staff is also considering updates to the code to better define how an ADU should be treated in terms of calculating the building square footage for a parcel. The state law includes the provision that an 800 square foot, 16-foot tall ADU is allowed on any parcel, regardless of the existing floor area or lot coverage. Staff has previously interpreted that this means that ADUs can exceed floor area or lot coverage limits for a parcel by up to 800 square feet, but that they still count towards the overall floor area on a parcel. The alternative interpretation is that the 800 square foot allowance counts as a floor area credit and does not count towards the overall floor area of the parcel, essentially allowing for more development potential on the parcel. This may be somewhat small point, but it can be a very important distinction on tight lots that are nearly maximized in terms of their development. And we could go either way on this as well, but we do need to clarify it in our code. Let's see, and as I mentioned, the state law does limit the height of an ADU that exceeds the floor area or lot coverage. The county is also considering whether or not to keep this provision in our code. Removing that height provision would allow for more development flexibility. And then one final point on floor area. The county code allows an applicant to increase overall floor area and lot coverage on a parcel by 2% on parcels with ADUs that are less than 6,000 square feet. The intent of that part of our code, which has been in the county code for a long time, has been to increase the ability of small parcels to accommodate ADUs. However, now that there is a state mandated 800 square foot ADU allowance, there's been some confusion about how that interacts with the 2% square footage allowance that was already in our code. For instance, can the 2% and the 800 square foot allowance be used together, or should the applicant only be using one or the other? Staff is actually considering simplifying the code at this point by removing the 2% provision altogether, since the 800 square foot provision does serve to address the issue of fitting ADUs onto small parcels. Okay, now to talk about access and parking. Our ADU code prohibits ADUs from having a separate driveway from the primary dwelling unless it's demonstrated that it is necessary in terms of safety or environmental protection. Currently, this requirement only applies in our urban area. Staff is considering expanding this rule to also apply in rural areas, recognizing the importance of protecting resources, reducing grading, and otherwise concentrating development on rural parcels. And then parking requirements for ADUs. The parking requirement in the state law is that junior ADUs and conversion ADUs do not require parking, but new construction ADUs require one parking space. There are certain exceptions where new construction ADUs do not need to require parking. The most common of which is location within 1/2 mile walking distance to a transit stop. The state ADU law also does not require property owners to replace parking when a garage is converted to an ADU. However, the HCD handbook stipulates that junior ADUs created from a garage conversion are not subject to this exemption, meaning that if we wanted to in our local code, we could require that if you build a junior ADU in a garage, that you provide the replacement parking on site. Staff is considering keeping in this provision for junior ADUs just to keep our code simpler and also to allow more development flexibility for property owners of junior ADUs. And then in Santa Cruz County, there are special parking regulations that apply in our coastal zone, which is the blue shaded area that's shown on the map on this slide. Coastal areas are often parking constrained due to visitors and residents both needing to find parking. And we are allowed to have different ADU regulations in our coastal zone as needed to implement the California Coastal Act. So for that reason, there are more parking requirements for ADUs in the coastal zone compared to outside the coastal zone. In particular, we do require garage conversions to provide replacement parking in the coastal zone. And within certain beach areas, Davenport, Pleasure Point, and Seacliff, we do not allow proximity to a transit stop to qualify for a parking exemption or parking exception. So at this point, we are considering whether to amend or remove these special coastal zone parking regulations, because we have heard from some property owners that parking has been a barrier to ADU project feasibility on small parcels where there may not be space to add more parking spaces. We have talked with the Coastal Commission staff about this issue, and it is our understanding that the Coastal Commission is likely to be supportive of some relaxing of these standards. Since this is such a hot topic, we actually would like to take a minute and do an interactive exercise with you. Natisha is going to share her screen, I believe, and then provide you with a link to a survey question about your preferences about coastal parking requirements. So please do answer the question and we will review the results in real time. Okay, looks like Natisha's screen is coming up. And okay, and then she's put the ADU policy poll here in the chat. So if you click that link on the ADU policy poll, you should be able to answer this question of where should we require off-street parking for new construction ADUs in the coastal zone? And the options are everywhere in the coastal zone. Oops, I don't know what the other options are. Sorry, Natisha, what are the other options?
Sorry about that. So we have everywhere in the coastal zone, within designated coastal communities such as Pleasure Point and Seacliff, only on specific streets near coastal access points, or do not require off-street ADU parking in the coastal zone. The other option is to fill in the blank with any other suggestions you might have.
Okay, so we'll just give it a minute for folks to answer the question. And Natisha, do you want to switch to the results page and we'll see the results coming in?
There we go. We've got some responses coming in right now.
Is it possible for you to zoom in your screen a little bit so that we can see a little bit more zoomed in?
I can try.
Aha.
Can you see that a little better?
Yeah. Well,
Not the
I can't
results.
see the results though.
There.
Ah, yes, much better.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, once again, if you click on the ADU policy poll link that was provided in the chat, you should be able to answer the question. Looks like we have about 30 responses, and they're somewhat varied. And you can continue voting, throughout the meeting, and we'll provide this data to the Planning Commission so that they understand, what you said here. But it looks like maybe about 1/3 of responses are to not require off-street ADU parking in the coastal zone. And then the next highest answer, it looks like, is only require ADU parking on specific streets near the coast. And then it looks like it's about even between the other three answers. Okay, well, that was fun. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Okay. All right, moving along here. Okay, so there are a few additional ADU standards where we are planning to make some updates. Regarding setbacks, the state law stipulates that ADUs must be set back from the side property line by at least 4 feet. Our existing code applies this rule only to interior side yards, meaning side yards between properties, but not to street side yards, which means side yards on corner lots. The HCD handbook does clarify that a setback of 4 feet is from any side yard lot line. So that would include street side yards. So for this reason, we will be applying that 4-foot setback to corner lots. And then regarding design, the county's existing ADU regulations include the provision that ADUs, quote, shall be compatible with the main dwelling. This is a subjective provision. There is not clarity on what it means to be compatible from a design perspective. According to state law, design standards for ADUs must be objective. An example of an objective standard might be ADU siding material and color must be the same as that of the primary dwelling, or something like that. So the existing subjective provision in our county code could be updated to be objective. However, staff is considering removing the design standard altogether in order to more easily accommodate prefabricated ADU designs that are becoming more common in the market. This idea has been well received at community meetings and public hearings so far. We are considering incorporating objective standards for historic preservation in order to ensure that ADU projects do not negatively impact designated historic resources. And these objective standards already exist in the county code. And then regarding disaster recovery, so one thing that has come up as folks have started to rebuild after the CZU fire is that it may be easier to build an ADU first, followed by a primary dwelling later. Our code currently doesn't allow for this. In fact, state ADU law doesn't allow for this, but staff is considering allowing ADU permit issuance and construction before primary dwellings, specifically in disaster recovery situations, with the caveat that you would need to show the development envelope or where your primary dwelling would be located on your plans for your ADU. We've heard a lot of support for this change so far. And then regarding occupancy, our regulations do require owner occupancy on properties with junior ADUs and on properties with ADUs that were permitted before 2020. ADUs that were permitted starting January 1st of 2020 are not subject to owner occupancy requirements because this is part of the state law. We have heard feedback from some property owners that the owner occupancy requirement is restrictive and it is a barrier to construction and occupancy of housing. For this reason, staff is considering adding some flexibility into the requirement by recognizing relatives of the property owner as qualifying as the owner. Another idea is to remove the owner occupancy requirement for ADU properties completely. The Planning Commission discussion on this topic has been split so far. And then regarding fire sprinklers are not required for ADUs if the primary dwelling does not have sprinklers. However, it's important to understand that fire sprinklers may actually be required if an ADU is part of a large addition to the primary dwelling. Also, the fire district may require alternatives to sprinklers, such as water storage, that may be just as costly or even more expensive than sprinklers. So since this has been a point of confusion, staff is considering adding that clarity into our code. And then regarding public improvements, the HCD handbook clearly states that no physical improvements can be required for the creation or conversion of an ADU. So for example, an applicant cannot be required to improve sidewalks or other frontage improvements in order to create an ADU, even though those things would usually be required if you're building a new house. Any requirements for life and safety that are in the building code, however, including fire access requirements, are still required for ADUs. This has also been an area of confusion, so we're planning to add that into the code as well. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to touch on a few changes that we're planning related to the ADU application process. So ADUs and junior ADUs that meet all development standards must be approved ministerially, which means that they only require a building permit, and that's the state law. The county's ADU regulations do currently require discretionary review, so that's an extra review for ADUs in certain non-residential zone districts. And these zone districts include commercial agriculture, timber production, and parks districts. The ADU handbook has clarified that an ADU that meets development standards should not require discretionary review in any zone district, even in these types of non-residential zone districts where we would usually require special review just to build a house. So for that reason, we will be updating that in our regulations. And then regarding fees, we have an option to add certain fees that we're not currently charging for ADUs. The HCD handbook clarifies that local jurisdictions can charge impact fees for junior ADUs and for certain conversion ADUs. Impact fees are fees related to a project's impact on public resources and infrastructure. On one hand, it may be appropriate to charge these fees since ultimately there will be people living in these units and those people will be creating demand for public resources and infrastructure. On the other hand, keeping conversion ADUs and junior ADUs exempted from impact fees would keep the financial investment associated with those ADU types a bit lower. And then regarding utility fees, a local agency, special district, or water corporation cannot consider ADUs as a new residential use for the purposes of calculating fees or charges for utilities, including water and sewer services. However, the HCD handbook does clarify that these provisions don't apply to an ADU or junior ADU that you're constructing at the same time that you're constructing a new single-family home as one big project. So staff is considering adding this provision into the ADU code, but we also have the option to leave our code as is. Okay, and that kind of concludes my summary of the changes that we're looking at right now. So now we're going to take the remainder of the meeting time for questions and discussion. I went over all the areas where we're considering updates. Please provide feedback on the topics that I talked about, as well as any other topics related to ADUs where you might be interested in seeing policy changes. The only restriction that we have is that our local ADU regulations cannot be more restrictive than state law. So to make a comment, if you're using a computer, you may type your comment or question into the meeting chat box, or you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen, choose raise hand and wait to be called on. And then when the moderator announces your name or phone number, you would then click on the microphone button to unmute yourself and start speaking. And then when you're commenting, please state your name and proceed with your comment. And then at the end of the comment, your microphone will be muted again. Let's see, and if your hand is still raised, but you don't have a comment or question, just click on the hand symbol to lower your hand. We're going to go through the comments in the chat first, and then we'll go through the raised hands. And then after that, I'm going to ask if there's anyone that's participating on the phone that would like to comment. If you want to provide a comment on the phone, you're going to enter *5 and to raise your hand. And then when we call on you, you'll click on the microphone icon or you'll click *6 to unmute your phone. Okay, and then in the interest of fairness, we will try to wait until everyone has had a chance to speak once before allowing folks to speak more than once. There's no official time limit to speaking like there is in a public hearing, but we do have a lot of people participating today, so please do keep comments and questions as brief as possible in order to allow everyone a chance. And if you have a comment that's very similar to another comment that has already been provided, you can simply state that you agree with what has already been said. And then finally, while we talk, here, I've provided on this slide some links to various resources that are available to you. Questions about specific properties or specific ADU applications should be directed to our zoning staff or our development review staff. Questions about building permit applications should be directed to our building staff. Questions about affordable housing or the county's ADU forgivable loan program should be directed to our housing staff. And then in addition to the contact information from our department, I've also provided a link to the county's ADU website, which is up to date with a toolkit of resources to help you understand the county's existing ADU rules. And let's see, there's also a link to the HCD ADU handbook that I've been talking about today, which is also available to the public. And then finally, one more thing, while we're talking, please do participate in a short survey to give us feedback on this community meeting so that we can understand what worked well and what we can improve on. I believe Natisha will add a link to that survey in the chat as well. Okay. So with that, I think we will start to take questions. So Natisha, what have we got in the chat?
Right. So some questions that I've seen are if this presentation will be made available after we're done here. People would like access to the slides.
Yes, yeah, so we're recording this meeting and it will be available on the county's ADU website, which is provided on this slide.
And another question is, what is the difference between an ADU and a tiny home? Is a tiny home a junior ADU?
That's a great question. Yeah, so tiny homes, so a tiny home is not defined in our county code, and there's no, universal definition, but generally it's considered to be a dwelling that's a maximum of 400 square feet, and it can either be on a foundation or on wheels. And a tiny home could be considered as an ADU. It also could be potentially considered as a primary dwelling if you have a vacant lot. So as a separate policy project, we are working on developing regulations in our zoning code for tiny homes. And we will be having community meetings on that this summer, but the two topics do interweave together somewhat in that a tiny home could potentially function as an accessory dwelling unit.
Okay. And Robson asks, I have an unpermitted ADU on my property. I want to get permitted, but scared that the county will make it difficult. My ADU was built to code a couple years ago. What should I do?
Oh, so the ADU is not permitted, but something was built to code? Oh, it was built to code, but it wasn't permitted. Got it.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so there's a couple of options. Don't be scared. There's a couple of options available. One option is that you can apply to get retroactive building permits for the work. If your space was built to code, then with some coordination with our building division staff, you may be able to obtain retroactive building permits for that work. It may require some level of deconstruction, though, in order for our staff to do the inspections that they need to do to confirm that it was built to code. The other option that you have is, if it's not possible to do enough of that deconstruction work to get those inspections done, you may be eligible for the Safe Structures program, which is a program where our building staff comes out and they do a basic safety inspection. And then you are given a certificate that the space is safe for habitation and people can continue living there. It's not quite the same as legalizing the unit or getting a building permit, but it does prevent the unit from going through code enforcement or anything like that here in the county.
And there was a question clarifying the parking requirements. If you build a garage as part of the main ADU, do you have parking requirements in SLV?
If you build a garage as part of the ADU?
As part of the main ADU, yes, that is. And that was Teresa Marks, if you have further explanation.
Okay. So if you build a new construction ADU and you are in the San Lorenzo Valley and you're not within a half-mile walking distance from a bus stop, then you are required to provide one parking space for that ADU. If you built a garage as part of the ADU project, then that would qualify as your parking for the ADU. And that applies even if you are underparked for the primary house. The new parking that you built could be associated with the ADU. So I think that answers the question.
And we have another question that's kind of specific to SLV. Are two septic tanks required for a detached ADU in non-sewer service zones?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ADUs outside our urban services line are going to be on septic. And when you have an ADU application in our rural area, you'll need to go through our environmental health department, and they will review the existing septic system and they will let you know what they require in terms of upgrades to that system. It might be a separate septic tank for the ADU, it might be an upgrade to the existing tank, or it might be determined that the existing tank or the existing septic system can accommodate the ADU. So it's really a matter for the environmental health department.
If you have a two-story outbuilding, could you have two ADUs, one up and one down? Both would have their own entrance.
Let's see. Let's say it's a parcel that has an existing single-family house on it. In that case, you can only have one ADU. If you wanted to do a junior ADU, the junior ADU would have to be converted from within the walls of the single family house. So the outbuilding, you could just have one ADU.
And we also have a couple of CZU wildfire questions. Perhaps this one can address them. So during the initial meeting for the CZU wildfire survivors, we were informed that we would be allowed to build an ADU first. And it seems from the slideshow that this is not the policy. Can you clarify this?
Sure. Yeah, and I should have done that in a more nuanced way in my presentation. So I appreciate the question. So currently, our ADU code our local code as well as our state law does not allow ADU construction before construction of a primary dwelling. However, in practice, our planning department has already been allowing that to occur for CZU fire victims. But what we're looking to do now is to codify that allowance and make it so that it's part of our actual zoning code, and we are consistent in our application of that allowance to everybody affected by CZU fire and also future disasters.
When building the ADU, does the new space count as a bedroom as it pertains to septic requirements?
Yes, it does.
And there's also just a comment to please permit 2 ADUs on parcels greater than 18,000 square feet. And there's a couple of commenters who agree. And also somebody mentioned, please remove the owner occupancy requirements for ADUs.
Okay.
No. Are the ADU sizes a hard limit? And they're discussing this in the context of prefab options.
Yes, the ADU size limits are hard. Yes, they're in their state law, and then they're also in our local code. So it's a maximum of 1,200 square feet for a detached ADU on parcels larger than 1 acre. And then on parcels smaller than 1 acre, you have a limit of 850 square feet if you have a 1-bedroom, or 1,000 square feet if you have a 2-bedroom. And then there's slightly different rules for attached ADUs that I may not remember exactly accurately, but those size limits that I just mentioned for the small parcels do also apply in some cases to attached ADUs. And then there's also another situation where you have a maximum of 50%. The ADU can be a maximum of 50% of the main dwelling unit. So there are, yes, there are maximum sizes that are baked into our local code as well as state law. And if we wanted to make some changes, we could do that. But we would need to do that with an updated ordinance. So if there's suggestions for different ADU size requirements that people would like to see, I would encourage those suggestions.
Another comment is your max height is 16 feet. What is the state requirement?
Yeah, the state requirement is that we cannot require ADUs to be shorter than 16 feet. So we are allowed to limit ADUs to 16 feet, but we couldn't, for instance, limit ADUs to be 15 feet. So beyond that, the state law is silent on height. Our rules here in the county, we only have the limit to 16 feet for our detached ADUs within the urban services line. Other than that, attached ADUs and detached ADUs outside the urban services line have a 28-foot height limit. There's also some special height limits related to ADUs above garages.
And we have a comment or a question from Shelley Flock from the Soquel Creek Water District. The law currently allows for utilities to charge connection fees for all new construction ADUs, not just those that are built at the same time as a single family home. Can you please correct or clarify this?
Sure. So let me get back to that slide. Hold on just a moment. Here we go. Yeah, so yes, I believe that this was for, that's a really good point. This is for conversion ADUs, so junior ADUs. So you're allowed to build a junior ADU at the same time that you build a new house. And right now we're not charging connection fees for that, but the state, according to the state law, we are allowed to do that. So that's the kind of nuance there.
Okay. And we have a number of questions in the chat, but if you'd like, we can transfer to raised hands and come back to these later.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead and transfer to raised hands. So
Good.
Stephanie.
Yep. We have several people with raised hands. The first person is Mando Morlos. You've been unmuted.
Mic check. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Hi, guys. My name is Mondo, and I'm a homeowner, and I built an ADU here in Santa Cruz. In addition, I actually worked with the state senators and their staffs on crafting some of this ADU legislation. And I wanted to bring to the point to everybody here that what we have for requirements for an ADU and a junior ADU as far as allowing them is the absolute bare minimum that we can legally allow. Meaning we can choose as a community to allow multiple ADUs, as many ADUs as we want on parcels. And I took this to the city of Watsonville, and they have since voted and enacted legislation that allows 2 full-size ADUs on any property within their city limits. Now, parcels here in unincorporated were much larger. And in Santa Cruz County in general, we have a great variety of different types of neighborhoods. We have areas that are very congested, and we have areas that are very open. So I am been pleading with you guys to please allow more ADUs in large parcels that can easily handle it, that wouldn't cause any parking problems or anything like that. It just makes common sense for a parcel that is right on the beach, that's tiny, doesn't have any parking. It can have 1 main house, 1 ADU, and 1 junior ADU. And a large parcel that has no traffic can only have the same. It just doesn't make common sense. So please allow that, like other cities are allowing. The next one I wanted to talk about was talking about disallowing separate ADU access for driveways. Again, we could have parking is such an issue. In some cases, the ADU may not be built at all if you disallow an extra driveway. So please allow extra driveways, because that keeps cars off the streets. And if people can park off street, that is an absolute ideal. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next person is Jessica Ayala. You've been unmuted.
Jessica, are you there?
Nope. Let's try one more time. Let's see. Jessica, can you unmute yourself? Okay. Our next question comes from Stephanie Lee.
Hey, thanks so much for this great presentation. I guess I was curious to know if, I guess I was curious to know more about conversion ADUs specifically. I know that currently there are some standards of specifically how much of an existing building can be rebuilt to be qualified as a conversion. And meanwhile, in Santa Cruz City, they allow a full reconstruction of a structure to count as a conversion. I'm curious if this might be like a direction that you are potentially moving towards, specifically as like buildings are sometimes brittle, old, and it might be safer for everyone to reconstruct entirely. Just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So that is actually, I don't know if I would define that as a gray area, but it's an area where HCD has provided a little bit more clarification in their handbook that they put together last year. So it's actually in the state law that if you can have a accessory building, for instance, be completely demolished and have an ADU built to that same envelope, that same building envelope, and that would be considered a conversion ADU for the purposes of the ADU regulations. And so that is actually something that I don't believe we have spelled out in our local code, and we could do that to make it more clear for applicants and staff. So that's a good point. And if someone does want to do a reconstruction of a structure that isn't structurally sound, they would just not be able to go beyond 150 square feet of additional square footage outside that original building envelope, because at that point it would be considered a new construction ADU.
Okay, our next person with the hand raised is Rena. You've been unmuted.
Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. It's very helpful. I was, and also just for clarifying the code, I think that's really important for the community. And I'm also curious if there's a way to be more transparent about the cost of building an ADU. We're finding that ADUs cost, upwards of $100,000, if not up to $300,000. And I think people aren't always aware of the expense that is really involved. And I'm just, I would just love to see more transparency as far as the fees and just the construction costs and things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Just to let you know, we do have some of that information available on the county's ADU website. We did contract with a consultant a few years ago and got a ADU financing guide put together, and so there was a lot of information in there about hard costs, soft costs, county fees. That particular guidebook does need to be updated, so it's not currently available on our website, but what our website does have right now is general information about costs for ADUs, as well as an ADU cost calculator, where you can put in information about your project and you can get out estimated county fees, as well as estimated kind of overall costs over time for the project if you're going to be renting the ADU. But it's definitely very important for people to be aware of how much an ADU costs, because there is quite a lot of variation also between the types of ADUs. For instance, a junior ADU might only cost you, I don't know, $70,000, $60,000, depending on the scale of the project and what's involved. But a new construction ADU might cost you, like you said, $300,000, just to build a new detached structure on a property. So there's certainly a lot of variation there.
Our next person with their hand raised is Amit. You've been unmuted. Amit, are you out there? Would you like to make a statement or have a question for Daisy? Okay. Our next speaker is Cove Britton. You've been unmuted.
What happened?
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, my name is did you hear me before? I'm sorry, I was talking.
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. My name is Forrest. Amit is here, and we are looking at an ADU rather under our existing home, and we would need a second driveway to make it work to go to the new parking that would have to be there. And I just heard something about that not being allowed. Is that really true?
Yeah, so in our current county code, if you're in our urban area, we do not allow a separate driveway for an ADU.
Urban area, we are in the county.
Unincorporated.
It's unincorporated.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so in the urban area of the unincorporated county, and then what we're considering is expanding that regulation to also apply in the rural area as well. We do have a caveat in the code that allows for, that does allow for a second driveway for an ADU if Department of Public Works determines that that is the better option in terms of safety and access. So you would still have an option there.
But it's like someone would have to say that's okay.
Exactly, yeah, so that
okay.
would be.
So for that, we may have to do this, just go outside of the ADU and normal building permit and do our thing. The other question that I have is, it has to do with, you say inside the walls. Does that include footprint? Like, does inside the footprint also mean inside the walls? I'm thinking about a junior ADU.
Yeah, it gets a little technical, so you might need to talk with someone in our development review staff about your specific project. I wouldn't, want to give you project advice here without seeing plans, but generally, like if you, for instance, if you have a basement, like non-habitable space can be included. It doesn't have to be like part of your living area of your house.
Is that considered inside the walls? Because we would prefer it otherwise. We would prefer to have a larger, not a junior ADU.
A standard ADU, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does it have to be freestanding away from the house?
No, a standard ADU can also be attached to the house or converted from a portion of the house.
Okay. That was it. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Cove Britton. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, should we maybe go to the next person and come back?
Yes, our next person, sorry, it disappeared. Our next person is Karen. You've been unmuted.
Hello?
Hello.
My name's Alex Budka, not Cove Britton. I don't know if that was for me. I just got unmuted.
Oh, yes. Are you under Karen? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm not. No, I'm under. I don't know if my name shows up differently, but it just gave me the option to unmute.
Well, go ahead. You got the floor.
Oh, cool. Alrighty. Thanks. So we buy apartments, and we're trying to build, ADUs on them, and we're doing that right now. But we kind of a lot of apartments, the majority of the apartments in the Santa Cruz area are really old, and therefore they've been grandfathered in on zoning variances throughout the years and whatnot. For example, one apartment we bought was like built in the 30s. So a lot of the time the zoning exceeds, or the amount of units exceed what the current zoning allows for. And therefore we have to go through like a level 5 zoning process to get them approved. So it kind of falls under a strange technicality where, like, you're going over zoning, over the current zoning, whatever that is. And then it puts us through like a more difficult, development process. But as an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, I would think that, we can get around that somehow and not have to deal with that kind of level.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that's one area where we have been able to coordinate with HCD staff, so staff from the State Office of Housing and Community Development, to understand better how they interpret that provision in the state law about non-conforming zoning conditions. And the way they interpret it is that regardless of the zoning on a site, we need to allow the minimum state law requirement with just a building permit. So for multifamily, that would mean that we could allow the two detached ADUs and the 25% unit conversion ADUs and that would be a change from our current practice, because our current practice has been referring applicants in that situation to our usual non-conforming densities process, which is the level 5 process with our zoning administrator. So that is a change that we are intending to make in our code.
Got it. So you're going to lower it from, I guess, like falling into the level 5 process to like a typical building permit?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, cool. And then I guess
intent.
to comment on the water, I guess, the water fees, I think a lot of them are pretty reasonable, but for example, in the Soquel Water District, it's like 35 grand per water meter, which could really kill a lot of ADU projects. So I just want to put in my 2 cents for that one as well. See if you can either lower them or eliminate them if possible.
Yep. Well, I believe there may be some folks from the water districts on the call, so and that comment will be available to them.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you. We still have Cove Britain on the list, and Karen, you've both been unmuted. Jessica Ayala, you've been unmuted as well. And Jim Helmer, you've been unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me? This is Jessica.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I was listening earlier on how the current ordinance now is an ADU per every residential home. And the county is considering only allowing one eighth. Hello?
Oh, you're cutting in and out a little bit. We missed that last part.
My understanding, the current ordinance is an ADU per residential home, and the county is thinking of changing it to an ADU per residential lot. Like example, my lot has 3 homes on it. One of them is the primary residence, and another home was built back in the 40s, 30s.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one here built in the 60s that was permitted, but without a kitchen. And I happen to be the, new owner, and I did not know that. And of course, somewhere along the line was, a kitchen was installed. So I guess my question would be, why would the county want to change and only allow one AUD per residential parcel instead of one per home?
Yeah, so the reason why we have considered that is because that is the state law minimum that was clarified in the handbook that was put together by the state agency this past year. So we have the option to change our regulations to be 1 ADU plus 1 junior ADU per single family parcel, or we can keep the regulations as they are with 1 ADU and 1 junior ADU per single family dwelling, or something in between, such as having a parcel size requirement. So there are a few options. I wouldn't say we're leaning a particular way, but those are all options that are available to us. And one thing I would say is that if you have a dwelling group on your property, if your property is large enough, you could potentially have all of those be permitted as single family dwellings rather than ADUs, but it depends how large your property is and whether it can accommodate all of those units.
Thank you. Our next speaker does not have a name, just under guest. But you've been unmuted.
Hi, this is Marcus. I just want to make the point, and it was made earlier, that given the size of some lots in the county, it would be great to have the updated legislation recognize more than one ADU on a parcel or APN. And secondly, given the updated legislation that now post-2020 permits, there's not a residency requirement for an ADU. That should be made retroactive for those that permitted ADUs prior to 2020. Those two comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next person is Rich. You've been unmuted. Okay. I'm just going to go back to the top of the list because we missed some people who've been unmuted. Cove Britton, Karen, Jim Helmer, Mondo Morlos, I think, has an additional comment.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Jim Helmer.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, we are on 11 acres in San Lorenzo Valley, conforming residential unit, 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Septic system is up to grade, considering an ADU, but we've been told on multiple occasions that we will need to install a second septic system conforming to Tier 1 state of California standards to do an ADU, which could be, with today's construction costs, $50,000, $60,000, maybe $70,000, which kind of makes the whole proposal to do an ADU for a family member or a rental unit for a low-income member, it makes it out of the question. We really need to look at this septic issue and the requirement for 2 septic systems versus just upgrade of the existing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And we actually do get a lot of comments on that topic, and that would not be part of this ordinance because it wouldn't be part of our zoning code, but we are certainly informing the environmental health department that all of these types of comments are coming in, and we will be working with them to see whether there are options or solutions that can be allowed within the constraints that we have with the Regional Water Quality Control District.
Okay, we have no new persons raising their hand, but some folks who've had their hand raised who have not spoken yet and are unmuted: Cove Britton, Karen, Mondo Morlos, and someone named Guest.
Okay, so Stephanie, next, maybe we should go to the phone. So let's see. So if you're on the phone and you would like to participate, you can press, I believe it's *5 to raise your hand.
Daisy, we have no phone numbers that have raised their hand so far.
All right. All right, well, let's hop back into the chat then. Are there more chats?
Yes, there are. And we've gotten a couple of similar questions. One of them is in regards to owner occupancy. Is the removal of owner occupancy for ADUs being proposed or at least considered as part of these proposed changes?
Yes, we are considering removing the owner occupancy requirement. Another kind of compromise option that we have considered is expanding the definition of owner to also include relatives of an owner. We did discuss this topic at the Planning Commission study session on March 24th, and the commissioners were split on this issue. So community feedback is very useful.
And another question is, will this ADU update not address tiny homes on wheels as ADU? Is that just going to be part of the updates in the summer?
Yes, that's correct. So tiny homes on wheels currently are not allowed for permanent habitation here in the county outside of designated RV parks. We are looking at regulations that would allow tiny homes on wheels to be permanent residences as ADUs or as primary dwellings, but that will be a separate policy project, and we will have community meetings on that this summer.
And we've received a number of questions about specific properties and building ADUs on specific properties throughout the county. And as Daisy has mentioned, I'd just like to recommend that you reach out to our zoning information desk for any questions about specific properties. You can contact them by phone, as Daisy's put on here on the presentation, at 831-454-2130, or you can email them at planning.zoninginfo@santacruzcounty.us. So we're going to try to focus here on more countywide questions and what's considered part of the proposed update. One comment we received is from Jarrett Samet. How does the county justify potentially regressing its current ADU policy to be more restrictive at a time when California and Santa Cruz County are facing considerable housing challenges?
Is that a question, or I guess that's a question? Yeah. So the one reason, well, there are two reasons that we're thinking about the option of decreasing the number of ADUs that could be built on a single family or multifamily property. The first reason is that we've gotten clarification from the State Agency of Housing and Community Development of what the actual state law minimum is. When we were putting together our code last year, we actually thought that what we were putting in our code was the state minimum. So we want to make sure that the public and decision makers here in the county are aware that what we have in our code currently is a little bit more than what is in the state minimum. So we do have that option. And then the other reason that we were thinking about it is parking, traffic impacts that are associated with having, more living units on a property. ADUs in particular, in terms of parking, ADUs in many cases do not require parking. And then also if you're converting an ADU from a garage, in many cases you don't need to provide replacement parking for the garage parking that's removed. And so that can create a parking impact. Although we certainly want to encourage ADUs as a housing solution here in the county, those are a couple of reasons why we were thinking about modifying our number of ADUs allowed on specific parcels.
And a number of people had questions regarding street setbacks or side setbacks as well. Can the front street setbacks for an ADU be reduced if reducing the setback drastically improves the parking situation on the lot?
So the state law has setbacks of, so side yard setbacks need to be 4 feet and rear yard setbacks need to be 4 feet. And then the front yard is going to be the same as what you'd usually have for a regular house. So usually 20 feet in most cases. If you need to, if you would like to decrease the setback further, what you would need to do is apply for either a minor exception or a variance. depending on how much you wanted to decrease that setback by. And those are both what we call discretionary review processes here at the county, which means that county staff reviews the application and makes findings on whether or not the application is still meeting the intent of our county code with the changes that are proposed.
And in regards to the 4-foot side yard setback, does the structure need to be detached for this setback to apply?
It does not. Okay. Both detached and attached ADUs are both subject to that setback.
Okay. There's a number of comments about expensive water service increases. When there's also any information regarding ADUs being built on properties with an HOA, or would that just be a question for the HOA, and if it's allowed despite being on a qualified zone?
Right. Yeah. So there actually was a state law that passed last year, that went into effect last year on this topic, specifically for single-family homes that are subject to an HOA. So for those situations, an HOA cannot disallow ADUs. So there cannot be anything in the covenants, codes, and restrictions for an HOA that would prohibit you from building an ADU. There can still be some limits imposed by an HOA on related to an ADU, but it cannot make it impossible for you to build an ADU. So that state law it's fairly brief. There's not a lot of detail in the state law, and it kind of leaves it up to the individual HOAs. And then if you have a condo that's part of an HOA, that state law doesn't actually apply to that situation.
Okay, and if you'd like, we only have a few minutes left, so we can go back to any raised hands if people are able to turn their mics on now.
Sure. Stephanie, any more raised hands?
We have a couple of raised hands. Cove Britain, you've been unmuted.
Hey, it looks like there was some technological problem. Might have been on my end, by the way. So not to give anybody a hard time, but I was trying.
We can hear you now, though. Go ahead.
Yeah, go. Thank you. Daisy did a great job and bringing up some new things and so on. But I have to say, I would really appreciate, and I think a number of other professionals that are processing these permits, to meet with you and staff and talk about where the rubber hits the road. I'm hearing a lot of how-tos. How do I do this? What do I do this? And I understand that completely. But for me, it's problematic because I'm more going, I want to understand and maybe disagree on interpretations of staff's implement, I can't even say it. Doing the code, how you're doing the code. Is it consistent with the community wants? Is it consistent with HCD is? And is it consistent with what the board is expecting? And that's a lot. There's a big difference between that and asking how to. And I think it would be really beneficial to everyone to separate those issues and to be able to have a meeting about how is the county interpreting these things with people that are getting permits. I can speak from experience. The process for getting an ADU is miserable. It's horrible. And it doesn't meet the time frames. It's profoundly costly. And I'm not the only one saying this, and I know that. So there needs to be some separation here on that, of understanding that, yes, staff thinks this, they think this is what HCD is saying, they think this is the process, but really what HCD is trying to say is we need these units. We need ADUs. And frankly, respectfully, really, county planning staff and building staff and environmental planning staff and public works needs to talk to the people that are processing these permits with the county supervisors, with the planning commissioners. These meetings are valuable, but they're not valuable for determining what are the appropriate ordinances, what is the appropriate process, how do we do this well. So far, you spent most of your time in this meeting telling people how to. And I really think what the Planning Commission was asking for, and the Board of Supervisors, is what are the appropriate codes? What are the appropriate ordinances? Not and how to. So I really, hope what people are left are going, no, we want to talk about the right ordinances, not a toolkit. That's not a valuable process here, I don't think. It has a value, but it's not the real value. We're trying to create ordinances. We're trying to create code. Thank you for your effort, though, Daisy. I understand, but this is not, I've sat in multiple ones of these, and I keep on going, I'm trying to talk about code, not how to. What code are we going to make? What ordinances? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your comment.
And our last person with their hand raised is Mando Morlos again. You've been unmuted.
Oh, he's still muted.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Daisy, for taking our critique. This is really valuable. So I wanted to touch again on with the multiple ADUs, because it seems like there's quite a bit of support from that, and how the county and some people in the building department have talked about, well, they could do that as a dwelling group. And I looked into that, and what I found is that the number of properties that are eligible to have a dwelling group is severely restricted. Virtually any house that has a home can have an ADU. And additionally, if you try to go to the dwelling group, even if you can do it, you lose all of the benefits of the ADUs, the impact fees, the setbacks, the fire sprinklers, all the things that legislation has gone through enormous effort in order to get these things built. You lose all of that. And as a result, if we as a community are sincere about trying to build housing that somebody who works an average job around here can actually afford, the dwelling group route isn't viable versus the ADUs. Because they're so streamlined now, it is possible to build an ADU where a school teacher or a regular person working here could actually afford it. So I hope that when that argument comes up again, because I've heard it, that you understand that it's just a silent way of disallowing any building. Please allow multiple ADUs, because that has the attempt to build affordable housing. And also, as far as the owner occupancy, the state legislation and the governor signed, I can't remember exactly which law it was, a law that says that you do not have to be an owner occupied currently as it stands right now. However, that law will only last a few years.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Daisy.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate the comments.
The next speaker who's raised their hand is Steve Young. You've been unmuted. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to speak.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I did lose both my main house and my ADU in the CZU fires. And my ADU was legally built in around 2003, back when the state and the county really wanted affordable housing, and I was in a program with that ADU to only rent to people as affordable housing. And it was that way for a number of years. And then I received a letter saying that that program was no longer and that I could charge what I wanted to for the ADU. There was never any mention of it being rented to family or extended family. This is the first I've ever heard about that. As it turned out, I, as the owner, did live in the main house that we lost, and my extended family lived in the ADU that we lost. But as we rebuild, I think my wife and I, as the owner, would live in the ADU, and my extended family would live in the main house. But just for the future, what if my wife and I, as the owner, lived in the ADU? Are we allowed to rent out the main house then to anyone? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, actually, under the current rules, you are allowed to do that. The owner occupancy, the owner occupancy requirement that exists in our code only requires that the owner live on the property. So you could live in either the ADU or the main house. And then in addition to that, if you build an ADU that is permitted between 2020 and 2025, that's 5 years, you are not subject to owner occupancy requirements at all. And then on top of that, we are considering whether to remove the owner occupancy requirements or amend the owner occupancy requirements outside of those 5 years in our local code.
Okay. And then I'm in a zone RA, I guess, rural agricultural. So is the automatic setback for a detached ADU automatically, is it 4 feet, even in rural agricultural, or is it 5 feet? Back when I built it, I had to actually get a variance to put it at 5 feet because the rule was 20 feet back then for my zoning. But so
yeah, the rules have changed since then. So it's a 4-foot side and rear setbacks.
Okay.
Regardless of your zone district.
Okay.
And the only thing I would say in the rural area is if you have any kind of environmental resource on your property that has a setback requirement, such as a stream or some kind of endangered species area or something like that, then those types of setbacks would still apply.
Okay, yeah, we don't have that. Thank you, though.
Okay, and I will say we're at 7:30. I'm happy to stay for a little while and answer a few more questions. And the meeting will be recorded for those that need to leave, and it'll be available on the ADU website. So, Stephanie, are there any more raised hands?
Yes, Stacy, there's one more person, Shelley Flock. I've unmuted you, but you'll have to unmute yourself to speak. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm Shelley Flock. I'm with the Soquel Creek Water District, and I just wanted to clarify, there was some, I guess, misinformation on pricing related to new service connections in our district, and we have a lot of information on our website, including cost information. So please check that out if you're interested in building an ADU in our service area. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That's the end of people who have raised their hands.
All righty. Natisha, any final comments from the chat?
There have been a few. I would say there was repeatedly the question about that 5-foot setback in rural areas was asked, and I think the distinction there is they were talking about fire code restrictions, 5-foot setbacks from property line fences specifically. So it might be helpful to have clarity on that.
Okay, yeah. So if there are fire safety setbacks, like so anything that's related to building safety that's coming from the building code, that will supersede that ADU zoning code setback of 4 feet. So that would fall under the kind of special environmental situation that you might have on a property in the rural area. So that would be a property specific thing to take a look at.
Yeah, I think that addresses some of the larger questions. Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, great. I'll just reiterate, we do have a short survey. Is that right, Natisha?
Correct. I've been sharing that in the chat, but I can copy that in there again.
Great. Yeah, so that survey is an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this community meeting, what would be helpful in the future, any more comments that you might have. You can also email me directly as the project planner on this project. Any comments sent to me, I will add to the public record, and they will make their way to the Planning Commission, Board of Supervisors, Coastal Commission, and all of those decision makers do take these public comments very seriously. So I do encourage you to comment if you have opinions on these policy issues.